I have rung a lot of doorbells in my life. 11 years on a delivery route will do that to you. You develop a feel for it the way you develop a feel for anything you do 10,000 times. Most doorbells you ring once, step back, wait. Package on the left, signature pad ready, smile when the door opens, have a good day, back to the truck. That is the transaction. That is what the job requires and what the day allows. But there are doors you learn over time to ring differently, not because the package is different, because the person on the other side of the door is different, and you have been paying attention long enough to know it. I rang the doorbell at 14 Alderton Place twice, always twice. The first ring was the one the job required. The second ring was mine. And for 8 months I thought the second ring was just a habit I had picked up without thinking about it. It was not until a Tuesday morning in March, when the door at 14 Alderton Place opened for the first time in 2 years, that I understood what the second ring had actually been saying all along, and what the boy on the other side of that door had been waiting for someone to say. If you have ever communicated something important in a language that most people around you did not know existed, this channel is for you. Subscribe right now, because every story I tell here is for the people who learned to speak in ways the world did not make room for and found out that someone was listening anyway. I will wait. My name is Marcus Webb. I am 44 years old. I drive a delivery route for a regional logistics company out of a distribution center in Quincy, Massachusetts. Route 7, South Shore Residential, which covers about 60 addresses spread across 4 towns, and which I have been driving for 11 years without once wanting to drive anything else. I am a single father. My daughter Simone is 19 years old, first year at UMass Boston, studying communications, which is either ironic or exactly right depending on how you look at it, and I lean toward exactly right. My daughter communicates better than anyone I have ever met. She learned how from her uncle, my younger brother David, who is 38 years old and who has been deaf since he was born and who is, without any competition at all, the most expressive person in our family, and possibly in any room he walks into. David is the reason I know anything worth knowing about silence. He is the reason I understood, eventually, what was happening at 14 Alderton Place. Simone's mother and I separated when Simone was 6. It was not a dramatic separation. It was the kind that happens when two people who care about each other realize that caring about each other is not the same as being built to navigate the same life. She is a good woman and a good mother, and she lives 20 minutes from us, and Simone has never for one moment felt the absence of either of her parents. I am proud of that. It required more intentionality than it probably looked like from the outside, and it required Simone's mother and me to make a series of decisions over many years where we put Simone ahead of our own preferences about how things should go, which is the ordinary description of what parenting requires, and also the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. Simone grew up between 2 houses, and she grew up knowing that both houses were safe, and that both people in them were paying attention. David was at every birthday. David was at every school play. David is the reason Simone signs fluently and communicates without words as easily as she communicates with them. And the reason she is studying communications is, I am certain, directly because David made her understand from the time she could walk that communication is not about the channel. It is about the presence behind it. I started learning American Sign Language when David was 4 and I was 10. Not formally at first. The way a 10-year-old learns anything, by watching and imitating and getting corrected and trying again. My parents enrolled David in a school for the deaf in our neighborhood in Dorchester, and they both took evening classes at the community center, and they brought everything home and practiced at the dinner table. And I sat at that dinner table every night and absorbed it the way children absorb language when language is alive in the room around them. By the time I was 14, I was more fluent in ASL than either of my parents, not because I was smarter, but because I was younger and because I spent more unstructured time with David than they did, hours of it, in the backyard, and in the bedroom we shared until he was 12, just the two of us talking in the language that was ours. I want to tell you what those years were actually like, because I think people imagine that growing up with a deaf sibling is a kind of burden, and I want to be precise about how wrong that is. Growing up with David was not a burden. It was an education in the full meaning of the word, the kind that does not come with a classroom or a credential, but that changes the way you move through the world permanently and for the better. David taught me, simply by existing and requiring me to be present to him, that communication is not primarily about sound, that the most important exchanges between people happen in the layer underneath language, in the face and the body and the specific quality of a person's attention toward you. He taught me that being heard is not the same as being understood, and that being understood is not the same as being truly met, and that truly meeting someone requires you to put down whatever you are managing in your own head and give them the full surface of your attention. He taught me this not by explaining it but by requiring it, because you cannot half attend to a signed conversation the way you can half attend to a spoken one. You cannot look away for a moment and catch up later. You are either present or you have missed it. I have been present in conversations ever since. There is something that happens when you grow up communicating with your hands that I do not think most hearing people ever experience. You become extraordinarily attentive to faces. In sign language, the face is not a backdrop to the conversation. It is half the conversation. The eyebrows, the mouth, the direction of the eyes, these are grammatical elements as essential as the shape of the hand. You cannot receive sign language without being completely present in the face of the person who is speaking it. And once you have trained yourself to read a face that fully, you cannot turn it off. You read every face. You read the faces of strangers on the subway and faces of customers who answer their doors on your route and the faces of children at the windows of houses as you pull up to the curb. You develop, without trying to, a comprehensive understanding of what a face is saying underneath what the mouth is saying, or not saying. David gave me that. I have been using it every day for 30 years without always knowing I was using it. I want to tell you about the route, because the route is important. 11 years on the same roads means you know the addresses the way you know the people you grew up with. Not their private lives, not their names necessarily, but their rhythms. You know which houses get the packages taken in before you are back to the truck, and which ones leave them until evening. You know which dogs will come to the fence and which ones will not. You know which doors open before you ring the bell and which ones never open at all and whose packages go back to the distribution center unclaimed more often than they should. You learn over time that a delivery route is not just a set of addresses. It is a set of small windows into other people's lives. And if you are the kind of person who pays attention, each one tells you something. I am the kind of person who pays attention. David made me that, and what 11 years on Route 7 has given me, on top of whatever David gave me, is a specific kind of knowledge about the houses on my route that I do not think any other person on earth has or could have, because it is built entirely out of repetition and observation, and the particular perspective of the person who shows up at your door with a package, and has about 90 seconds to register what the door tells them before it closes again. In 90 seconds, if you are paying attention, you can learn more about a house than you would think. You can learn whether the person inside it slept. You can learn whether something happened yesterday that has not yet been processed. You can learn whether the quiet of the house is the quiet of contentment or the quiet of something else. I have been doing this for 11 years without writing any of it down. It lives in the part of my brain that David built, the part that reads faces and rooms and the quality of silences, the part that knows, before my brain has caught up, when something on the other side of a door needs more than the transaction the job requires. 14 Alderton Place came onto my route about 2 years before this story reaches its center. It is a large house on a quiet residential street in Milton, the kind of house that has a proper front path and a covered porch and a doorbell that works, and yet where something always felt, from the first delivery, slightly held in. The lights were usually on, but the blinds were almost always drawn. Packages were ordered frequently and in quantity, the kind of ordering that suggests someone who is managing a household from inside it rather than moving through the world outside it. The door was answered. When it was answered, by a woman in her early 40s, who I came to know as the resident of the address without knowing her name for the first several months. She was always composed, always pleasant in a careful and somewhat distant way, and always slightly too quick to close the door after signing for a package, the way a person closes a door when they are managing something on the other side of it that they do not want to risk being seen. I learned her name the way I learned most things about my route addresses, sideways and in pieces. A name on a package, a neighbor mentioning her. Eventually a piece of mail I had to hand over directly when the package required a signature. Her name was Renata Solano. She was the founder and CEO of a mid-size environmental consulting firm in Boston, a company she had built over 15 years into something well-regarded in its field. She had a son. His name was Oliver. He was 8 years old and he did not speak. I learned this not from Renata directly, but from the way the house breathed around him, from the particular quality of the stillness at the windows, from the shadows that moved behind the drawn blinds sometimes when I came up the front path, from the way Renata answered the door on some mornings with the specific expression of someone who has been managing a difficult hour before breakfast and is presenting the managed version rather than the hour itself. I am not describing something I deduced from evidence. I am describing something I recognized in the way you recognize the shape of a thing you have seen up close before. I had seen it in my own parents' faces on the mornings after nights when David had had a hard time. I had seen it in my own face in the mirror on the mornings after Simone had had a hard time. It is the face of a parent who has been carrying something heavy since before sunrise and is now standing in a doorway trying to be just a person answering the door. Oliver, I understood gradually, had stopped speaking about a year before I started delivering to that address. Not a medical silence, no structural reason the doctors could find, no injury or illness that explained it cleanly. A chosen silence. Or not chosen exactly, because no child chooses to go quiet in that complete way, but a silence that had settled over him the way weather settles over a place, gradually and then entirely, until the absence of speech was simply the climate he lived in, and the adults around him had exhausted themselves trying to change the forecast. I learned from the single conversation Renata and I ever had about Oliver directly that there had been a period before the silence that she described only as very difficult, and that she had tried everything she could find in the year since, every specialist and therapist and program, an approach that money and determination could reach. She said this in the way people say it when they mean it all the way down, when the word everything has been earned by actually trying everything and finding out that everything was not the thing. Oliver had not spoken a word to anyone outside the family in 14 months. I remember the way she said 14 months, not a round number, a precise one. The kind of number you count to when you are the parent of a child who has gone quiet, because you know the exact day it started and you have been counting from it ever since. The way you count the days of a thing you are waiting to be over even when you have stopped being certain it will be over. I started ringing the bell twice sometime in the second month of deliveries to that address. I did not decide to do it. It happened the way habits happen, gradually and without announcement, emerging from somewhere below the level of conscious decision and establishing itself before the conscious mind has had time to examine it. The first ring was the standard ring, the one the job called for, firm and clear, the ring that says I am here, I have a package, please come to the door. The second ring, a beat after the first, was softer, not tentative, just softer. The way you knock on a door when you are letting someone know you are there rather than demanding they answer. The difference is small in volume and enormous in meaning. And I had been making that difference for 30 years without thinking about it because David had made it necessary when we were children. When we were small and sharing a bedroom, I had worked out a knock for the door. Not the knock you use when you need something immediately. A different knock. Two of them, the second one softer than the first. It meant me, Marcus, no emergency. Take all the time you need. I will be here when you are ready. David had invented his own response without me asking him to, because that is what David does. He meets you exactly where you are and answers in kind. His response was 2 knocks back, the second one softer. It meant I hear you, come in. We used this knock for years, through childhood and adolescence, and into our 20s when we no longer shared a bedroom but still knocked on each other's doors in the way that the language of siblings survives the geography of separate apartments and separate lives. I had not thought about this knock consciously in years. I was not thinking about David when I rang the bell at 14 Alderton Place twice on my second month of that route. I was just doing what my hands had always done when they wanted to say through a door that there was no demand on the other side of it. No urgency, no requirement, just someone who would be there when you were ready. 8 months I rang that bell twice, every delivery, without fail, not thinking about it, not connecting it to David or to Oliver or to anything at all, just ringing it the way I had learned to ring things when the person on the other side needed to know that time was theirs. 8 months is a long time. It is long enough for a sound to become familiar. Long enough for a child sitting upstairs in a quiet house to have heard it many dozens of times, and to have started, gradually, to understand that this particular ring, this second softer ring that nobody else's deliveries made, was trying to tell him something specific. Long enough for that child to have started listening for it the way you listen for a signal you are not yet sure you are reading correctly, with the patience and the discipline of someone who has decided that the truth of the signal is worth waiting for. 8 months into the deliveries, on a Tuesday morning in March, I came up the front path at 14 Alderton Place with a medium-sized box from an educational supplier, which I mention only because the category of the package is relevant to what I am about to tell you, and because I notice these things the way I notice everything on the route, as data that accumulates into understanding. I rang the bell. First ring standard, the way the job required. Second ring softer, the way my hands had learned to do it. I stepped back to the left with the package and waited. The door opened, not after a long wait. Almost immediately, which was not the pattern. Renata always took a few seconds, the few seconds of someone putting down whatever they were holding before they could open a door. This was different, and it was not Renata who opened it. It was Oliver, a boy I had never seen in person before, only as a shadow behind a blind, only as the shape inside the quality of the house's silence. 8 years old, slight, in a gray sweatshirt and bare feet, standing in the doorway of his mother's house looking at me with the most careful and measuring eyes I have seen in a child since David was small. Not frightened eyes, not shy eyes, evaluating eyes, the eyes of someone who has been conducting a long experiment and is now seeing whether the hypothesis holds. He did not speak. He looked at me for a moment, and then he looked deliberately at the doorbell beside the door, and then he looked back at me, and he raised his right hand, and he knocked twice in the air in front of him, his small hand moving through nothing, the second knock softer than the first, telling me in the plainest possible language that he had understood the signal, that he had been listening to it for 8 months from his room upstairs, that he had been counting the rings and weighing them and deciding what they meant, that he had decided, and that he had come downstairs to say so. I did not speak immediately. I understood what was happening too clearly to risk filling it with words. I looked at him, the way David had taught me to look at a person who was communicating something important in a language other than speech, with my whole face present, with my eyes saying the same thing the careful stillness of my body was saying, which was, I received that. I have been saying it to you for 8 months and you heard it and here you are, and I have all the time in the world. After a moment, I held out the package. He took it with both hands the way children take packages when they are not sure yet what the rules are but are willing to find out. And then, before I turned to go back to the truck, I raised my right hand and knocked twice in the air, the second one softer than the first. He watched me do it. His face did something I will not try to describe precisely, because I think the precise description would make it smaller than it was. I went back to the truck. I finished the route. I called David from the parking lot of the distribution center that afternoon and I told him what had happened, and there was a long silence on the phone, and then David said, in his careful way, you spoke his language. And I said, you taught me the language, David. And he laughed and said, no, you taught yourself. I just gave you the alphabet. Renata called the delivery company 3 days later and asked to speak with whoever drove Route 7. It took 4 days for the call to get to me because that is how logistics companies work, which is to say imperfectly and slowly, but it got to me. She said she needed to tell me something. She said that Oliver had come downstairs that Tuesday and asked her who rang the bell. Not said, asked. With his voice, the first words he had directed at her in 14 months were who rang the bell, and she had told him it was the delivery driver, and he had nodded and gone back upstairs, and she had stood in the kitchen for 20 minutes before she could move. She was not crying when she told me this on the phone. She was something past crying. The particular state that comes after you have cried everything available and are now in the territory of something quieter and more permanent, the territory of a parent who has been given back something she had begun to quietly, privately, when no one could see her doing it, believe she had lost. I want you to understand what 14 months means for a parent in that position, not as a unit of time, but as a unit of endurance. 14 months of watching your child move through the world in a silence you did not cause and cannot fix. 14 months of specialists and programs and hopeful appointments and careful optimism, and the specific exhaustion of having the conversation with yourself, over and over, about what to do next, whether you have missed something, whether there is one more thing you have not yet tried. Renata Solano had built a company from 12 people to a respected regional firm over 15 years. She was not a person who did not know how to solve problems. She was one of the most effective problem solvers in her field. And she had spent 14 months being unable to solve the only one that kept her awake at night. She said she did not fully understand what had happened until Oliver explained it to her later that week, slowly and in pieces, the way children explain things when the thing is large and they are still locating it in language. He told her that the bell always rang twice. He told her the second ring was different from the first. He told her it sounded like it was saying no rush. He had been listening to it for 8 months from his room upstairs. He had been trying to figure out if it meant what he thought it meant. On the Tuesday in March he had decided it did. She asked me why I rang it twice. I told her about David. I told her about the knock on the bedroom door when we were children. I told her that I had not been thinking about David when I started doing it, but that I had been thinking about the house and about the particular quality of its silence, and that my hands had known something my brain had not yet caught up with. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, he has a therapist now who works with selective mutism, a good one, the right one, and he talks to her. He is starting to talk to me. He talked to his teacher last week for the first time since 2nd grade. She said, I do not know what to do with the fact that the thing that reached him was a doorbell. I told her it was not the doorbell, it was the second ring. The doorbell was just the instrument. What reached him was the message. No rush. I am here. Take all the time you need. She said she wanted to thank me properly. She said she wanted to pay me something. I told her there was nothing to pay. She said there had to be something. I thought about it for a moment. I told her there was one thing. I told her that whenever Oliver was ready, whenever it felt right to him and not a moment before, I would like to meet him. Not formally, not as an occasion, just as the man who drives Route 7 and who has a brother named David and who knows a thing or two about the languages people speak when they are not speaking. She said she would ask him. 2 weeks later, I came up the front path at 14 Alderton Place and the door opened before I rang the bell and Oliver was standing in it with a folded piece of paper in his hand. He held it out to me. I took it. I unfolded it. It said, in careful handwriting, 2 rings means you. I folded it back up and I put it in my shirt pocket and I looked at him and I knocked twice in the air, the second one softer, and he knocked twice back, and that was the whole conversation and it was enough. I have thought about this many times since, about what it means that a child in a house on a quiet street in Milton spent 8 months listening to a doorbell and finding a signal in it that nobody had put there intentionally, about what it tells you about children who have gone quiet, that they do not stop receiving. They stop transmitting because transmitting has become too costly or too dangerous or too exhausting in ways that the adults around them do not always understand, but they receive everything. Every tone, every tempo, every small variation in the way the world knocks on their door. They are not absent. They are intensely, exhaustingly present, sorting through every input for the one that finally says what they have been waiting to hear. Oliver waited 8 months. He waited through 14 months of silence before that. He was 9 years old, and he had been doing the most patient and disciplined listening I have ever witnessed in a human being. And when the signal finally came, he came downstairs and opened the door. The signal was not a therapy program or a specialist's technique or an intervention designed by someone with credentials. It was a delivery driver who grew up with a deaf brother and whose hands remembered a knock from 30 years ago and passed it on without knowing it. That is the whole of it. That is all it was. I think about this when people ask me what I do for a living, because the question is really asking something else. What they are asking is whether what I do matters, whether Route 7 and 60 addresses and 140 deliveries a day adds up to something worth doing. And I want to tell you because I think you deserve to hear it directly. The answer is yes, but not for the reason most people would expect. It does not matter because of the efficiency or the convenience or the commerce it enables. It matters because 60 addresses is 60 doors, and 60 doors is 60 opportunities to be the one thing that that particular house needs that day, which is sometimes just a package, and sometimes, without your knowing it in advance, something else entirely. The work is not small because it is invisible. The work is not small because most people who receive the package never think about the person who delivered it. The work is exactly the size it is, which is the size of what it can do when the person doing it is paying attention. David taught me to pay attention. 30 years of paying attention produced a habit. The habit produced a ring. The ring reached a boy. That is a chain I could not have built intentionally. I could only have built the first link, which was the decision, made when I was 10 years old at a dinner table in Dorchester, to be present in my brother's language. Everything else followed from that. I called David the evening after Oliver gave me the note. I told him about the folded paper. I told him what it said. There was the long silence that David does when something is landing in him, the specific quality of his pauses that I have known since childhood, and that always means the same thing, which is that he is giving the thing the room it deserves before he speaks. And then he said, in his careful way, 2 rings means you. And I said yes. And he said, that is the best thing I have heard in a long time, Marcus. I said, you started it, David. He said, you finished it. And I said, Oliver finished it. And David laughed again, the laugh that has been one of the best sounds in my life for 38 years. And I laughed, and Simone, who was in the next room doing her homework and listening to everything the way she always has, knocked twice on the wall between us, the second one softer than the first. I want to leave you with one thing before you go, because it is the thing I keep coming back to. Not the doorbell, not the moment Oliver opened the door, the 8 months before it. The 8 months of a child upstairs in a quiet house, listening. Not passive listening. Active, patient, careful listening of the kind that takes more discipline than most adults I know have ever been asked to produce. Oliver was doing something during those 8 months that I do not think anyone around him understood at the time, including his mother, including the specialists. He was not refusing to engage. He was waiting for the right signal. He was sorting through every input that arrived at his door, every therapy, every specialist, every well-meaning adult with a plan and a credential, and he was asking of each one the same question. Does this sound like it is in my language? Does this feel like it has room for me in it? Or does it require me to become something different in order to receive it? The sessions that asked him to change, however lovingly, did not pass the test. The bell that arrived twice a week and asked nothing of him at all, and whose second ring sounded exactly like no rush, passed the test after 8 months of evaluation. He came downstairs and opened the door. Oliver spent 8 months listening to a doorbell and finding in it a message that was not put there on purpose. He found no rush in a second ring that his mother's money and her specialists and her determination could not find anywhere in 14 months of trying. Not because those things were wrong or bad or insufficiently applied, because they were all arriving at his door with something required of him in return. Every therapy, every specialist, every carefully designed intervention, however loving, was asking him to produce something, to move in a direction, to be measurable progress. The second ring asked him for nothing. It said only, I am here. No rush. Take all the time you need, and he took it. He took 8 months of it, and then he opened the door. Is there someone in your life who has gone quiet, not because they have nothing to say, but because no one has yet knocked in a way that sounded like that? Not demanding, not expectant, not arriving with a plan for their recovery. Just present, just patient, just knocking twice and waiting. Tell me about them in the comments. Tell me their name if you want to. I read every single one and I would be honored to know. Hit subscribe if you have not yet. Leave a like so this reaches the parent, the sibling, the friend who needs it tonight. And I will see you in the next one.